The first thing you need to understand about being trapped on Kythera 7 when the Great Devourer came is that hope dies slowly, then all at once. I'm writing this in what I believe to be my final hours, hunched over a flickering cogitator in the depths of mining station Tertius, listening to the scraping sounds that have been growing closer for days now. The ventilation shafts carry more than recycled air these days. They carry the wet clicking of mandibles and the organic rustle of creatures that should not exist in the Emperor's universe. My name is Overseer Thaddeus Vork, and I supervised the extraction operations on this miserable rock for 17 years before the shadow fell across our star. 17 years of breathing recycled air that tasted of metal and desperation. 17 years of watching servo skulls drift through corridors lined with pipes that wept condensation like tears. 17 years of filing reports that no one in the administratum would ever read. I thought I understood what suffering meant. I thought I knew what it was to be forgotten by the Emperor's light. I was wrong about so many things. The astropathic choir went silent on the 37th day of Secundus, which should have been our first warning, but we were too deep in the quotas to notice. The miners were hauling up their usual loads of promethium ore. The servitors were performing their endless mechanical genuflections, and I was reviewing production reports when the screaming started from the surface stations. Not human screaming. You understand, we were used to that. The deep mines claimed their share of flesh regularly enough that a man's death cry was just another sound in the industrial symphony. This was different. This was the sound of metal being torn apart by something that understood hunger on a molecular level. Vox communications lasted another 3 hours after that first scream, long enough for us to learn that Kythera City had gone dark, that the orbital defense platforms were firing at shadows, that something vast and impossible was blotting out the stars. The last transmission I received came from Governor Malthius himself, his aristocratic voice cracking like old leather as he reported that the PDF positions were being overrun by creatures that defied description. He signed off with a prayer to the Emperor that ended in static and what sounded like wet tearing. That was 40 days ago, though time has become a fluid concept down here in the dark. The chronometer on my cogitator insists on its digital certainty, but my body tells a different story. I've watched my hands grow thin and pale in the emergency lighting, watched the other survivors change in ways that have nothing to do with simple starvation. We've been cut off from the surface for so long that some of the men have started talking about digging deeper, as if somehow going further into the planet's bowels would save us from what waits above. They don't understand what I've begun to suspect, that there is no deeper to go. The creatures that fell from the sky aren't just on the surface anymore. They're in the walls, in the air recyclers, in the water that we've been drinking and the rations we've been consuming. Every breath we take carries spores that taste like copper and decay, and every meal leaves us weaker despite filling our bellies with something that barely qualifies as nutrition. I should explain how we ended up down here, trapped like rats in the Emperor's own cellar. Mining Station Tertius was never meant to be a refuge. It was a processing facility, designed to handle the raw materials that came up from the deep extraction sites before shipping them off-world. When the first reports of the invasion reached us, my immediate instinct was to evacuate upward, to join the PDF lines or at least reach the spaceport before the orbital bombardment began. It was Foreman Kravex who convinced me otherwise, his augmetic eye whirring as he calculated our odds of survival on the surface versus staying put in the reinforced underground complex. The station's got 6 months of emergency supplies, he'd argued, his Vox grill crackling with static. Reinforced walls rated for mining explosions, air filtration systems that could handle a toxic gas leak. We wait it out down here until the Navy arrives for cleanup operations. It had sounded reasonable at the time, even prudent. The Imperium had faced Xenos threats before, and while these Tyranids sounded particularly unpleasant, surely the combined might of the Imperial Guard and Navy would drive them back into the void where they belonged. 37 of us made it down to the station before sealing the blast doors. Miners, mostly, with their pale, sunken faces and augmetic breathing apparatus. A handful of tech adepts who'd been servicing the extraction equipment. 3 members of the local ecclesiarchy who'd been blessing the new tunnels when everything went to the warp, Kravegs and his crew of foremen, a scattering of others whose names and faces have blurred together in the weeks since Clark's, servitor keepers, a single guardsman who'd been on leave when his unit was mobilized. The first week passed in something approaching normalcy, if you could call existing in an industrial tomb normal. We rationed the food, maintained the equipment, and took shifts monitoring the surface feeds until they went dead one by one. The men played cards with dirty decks and told stories about the women they'd left behind in Kythera City. Some of them even managed to sleep, curled up in maintenance alcoves or stretched out on the cold metal floors of the storage bays. I envied them their ignorance. I'd been reading the tactical reports that came through on the encrypted command frequency before it too fell silent. The Tyranids weren't just another Xenos invasion force to be driven back with lasgun fire and righteous fury. They were a plague, a living apocalypse that consumed everything in their path and used it to make more of themselves. Worlds didn't survive Tyranid invasions. They got eaten, down to the bedrock, until nothing remained but barren spheres of lifeless stone drifting through space. The knowledge sat in my belly like poisoned wine, fermenting into despair as the days stretched on without word from the outside. When the surface feeds finally died completely on day 12, I think some of the men actually felt relieved. It was easier to imagine that salvation was coming when you couldn't see the evidence to the contrary. The first sign that something was wrong came on day 18, when Jordan the tunnel rat failed to report back from his inspection of the lower water recycling systems. Jordan had been working these tunnels for 15 years, knew every pipe and junction like the scars on his hands. He wasn't the type to get lost or fall down a maintenance shaft. When we found him 3 days later, he was still technically alive, but the thing wearing his face wasn't Jordan anymore. He was stuck halfway through a ventilation grate that should have been too small for a human body. His limbs twisted at angles that defied anatomy. His skin had taken on a waxy, translucent quality that revealed the dark veins beneath, and those veins pulsed with a rhythm that had nothing to do with a human heartbeat. When he saw us approaching with our glow rods and cutting tools, he smiled with too many teeth and made a sound like wind passing through a corpse. "It's beautiful down there," he whispered, his voice hollow and echoing. "You should come see. Come and be part of the network, part of the feast." The words came out wrong, like he was trying to speak with a mouth that had forgotten its original purpose. When we tried to pull him free, his body came apart in our hands like wet clay, leaving behind a smell that made 3 of the men vomit and sent the rest of us running back to the upper levels. That's when Kravegs made his first real mistake. Instead of sealing off the lower levels immediately, he sent a team down to investigate what had happened to Jordan. Professional curiosity, he called it, his augmetic implants clicking as they processed data that contradicted his understanding of human biology. The tech adepts supported him, their binary cant full of excitement about studying Xenos bioforms in a controlled environment. Even some of the miners volunteered, eager to prove that they weren't afraid of whatever had gotten to poor Jordan. I should have stopped them. I should have pulled rank and ordered the blast doors sealed, but I was still thinking like a rational man dealing with a comprehensible threat. I thought we were facing some kind of infection, maybe a bioweapon that the Tyranids had deployed to weaken planetary defenses, something that could be contained and studied, and eventually overcome through proper Imperial procedure. The team came back 6 hours later, but they came back wrong. Not all at once, and not obviously at first, but wrong in ways that took time to manifest. Minor Kellis complained of headaches and started picking at his skin until it bled. Tech Adept Zorian's augmetics began malfunctioning, producing error messages in languages that didn't exist in any Imperial database. Foreman Grask developed a taste for the lubricating oils used in the drilling equipment and started drinking them when he thought no one was looking. Within a week, all 5 members of the exploration team had undergone changes that defied medical explanation. Their behavior became increasingly erratic, and they started spending time together in whispered conversations that fell silent whenever anyone else approached. I caught them more than once standing perfectly still in darkened corridors, their eyes reflecting the emergency lighting like animals. When I asked them direct questions about what they'd seen in the lower levels, they gave vague answers about biological integration and synaptic networking that raised more questions than they answered. The breaking point came on day 28, when we found Kellis trying to force-feed one of the other miners a handful of something that looked like grey paste mixed with metal shavings. The substance was moving on its own, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly, and the smell it gave off was indescribable, like flowers blooming in a charnel house. When we pulled him away, Kellis screamed that we were interrupting the process and that we'd all understand soon enough what it meant to be part of something greater than ourselves. That's when I finally ordered the lower levels sealed. Too late, of course, but I'd reached the limits of my ability to rationalize what was happening to my men. Kravix protested, claiming that we needed access to the water recycling systems and that sealing the lower levels would doom us all to slow death by dehydration. I told him that we were already doomed and that all we could do now was choose how we wanted to die. The 5 infected men, though infected, seemed too small a word for what had happened to them, didn't take kindly to being cut off from whatever was calling to them in the depths. They became increasingly agitated as the hours passed, pacing the corridors like caged animals and making sounds that no human throat should have been able to produce. On the second night after the sealing, they tried to break through the blast doors using nothing but their bare hands and teeth. We found them the next morning, their fingers worn down to bone, and their mouths full of metal fragments, still clawing at the reinforced barriers with desperate intensity. We had to make a decision then, one that would haunt every survivor for the rest of their shortened lives. The infected weren't just a threat to themselves anymore, they were becoming something else entirely, something that responded to signals we couldn't perceive, but that seemed to emanate from the very walls around us. Captain Morrison called for an emergency meeting of the remaining senior staff in the command center, the only room we could be certain hadn't been compromised by whatever influence was seeping through our defenses. The discussion was brief and brutal. We had 23 people showing signs of infection, ranging from the mild behavioral changes we'd initially dismissed as stress to the complete psychological breakdown we'd witnessed in the sealed sections. Medical Officer Chen presented her findings with the clinical detachment of someone who had already accepted the inevitable. The neural patterns she'd observed suggested that the infected weren't losing their minds so much as having them rewritten, restructured to serve a purpose we couldn't yet comprehend but could feel pressing against us like a tide. Morrison's voice cracked when he gave the order. We would establish a quarantine within the quarantine, sealing the infected in the lower maintenance levels where they could be monitored but contained. It was presented as a temporary measure, a way to keep them safe while we searched for a treatment, but everyone in that room knew we were condemning them to a living death. The alternative, the possibility that they might somehow compromise our defenses from within, was simply too dangerous to risk. The transfer happened at dawn on the 4th day. Those who were still lucid enough to understand what was happening went quietly, some even expressing gratitude that we were keeping them away from the others. They knew what they were becoming, even if they couldn't stop it. Private Williams, who had been one of our most reliable communications operators, paused at the threshold of the maintenance level and turned back to look at us. Her eyes held a terrible clarity as she spoke. "It's not malicious," she said, her voice carrying an odd harmonic quality that made our teeth ache. "It doesn't hate us. It just needs us to be something else." Then she stepped through the threshold, and we sealed the blast doors behind her. The silence that followed was perhaps worse than the screaming had been. We could still hear them sometimes, especially at night, but their vocalizations had changed. Where once there had been human cries of distress, now there were sounds that seemed almost melodic, complex patterns of tone and rhythm that seemed to respond to each other across the sealed sections of the facility. Analysis of the audio recordings revealed mathematical relationships in the frequencies, suggesting a form of communication far more sophisticated than anything we'd previously attributed to the Tyranid species. By the 6th day, we began to notice changes in the facility itself. It started small, minor fluctuations in the power grid that our engineers couldn't explain, variations in atmospheric pressure that had no identifiable source. The automated systems began reporting glitches, sensors detecting movement in areas we knew to be empty, temperature readings that fluctuated wildly despite our environmental controls remaining stable. Jenkins, our chief engineer, was the first to suggest what we were all beginning to suspect. The biological matter that had penetrated our initial defenses wasn't just trying to infect the human occupants. It was attempting to integrate with the facility's infrastructure itself. Microscopic analysis of the ventilation filters revealed organic compounds that defied classification, structures that seemed to bridge the gap between biology and technology in ways that our current scientific understanding couldn't accommodate. The implications were staggering. If the Tyranids could somehow merge organic and mechanical systems, then no technological defense would be sufficient. Our sealed bunker, designed to withstand conventional sieges and even nuclear attacks, might be nothing more than a shell waiting to be cracked open from within. On the 8th day, we lost contact with the outside world entirely. The communication array had been functioning normally, but suddenly every frequency returned nothing but static. Emergency protocols called for a manual inspection of the equipment, but the communication room was located in a section we'd sealed off after detecting high levels of contamination. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez volunteered to make the journey in full hazmat gear, maintaining radio contact as he navigated the darkened corridors. His reports grew increasingly disturbing as he progressed. The walls in the contaminated sections had developed what he described as a texture, raised patterns that seemed almost deliberate in their design. The air recycling system was functioning, but the quality of the atmosphere had changed subtly. It was still breathable, but it carried scents that reminded him of rain on summer Earth, mixed with something metallic and sharp. When he reached the communication room, Rodriguez's final transmission was barely coherent. The equipment appeared to be functional, but it had been modified. Organic growths had integrated with the electronic components in ways that should have destroyed the delicate circuitry, but instead seemed to have enhanced it. Before we lost contact with him entirely, he reported that the communication array was operational, but no longer under human control. It was broadcasting something, a complex signal pattern that he couldn't decipher, but that filled him with an inexplicable sense of longing. We never saw Rodriguez again, though we occasionally picked up transmissions on his radio frequency. The voice was his, but the words made no sense. Complex mathematical formulations mixed with what sounded like poetry in a language that had never existed before. After 3 days, even those transmissions stopped. The psychological toll on the remaining survivors became our greatest challenge. We had started with 47 people in the facility. Now we were down to 18, not counting those we'd sealed in the quarantine sections. Every day brought new signs that our isolation was not as complete as we'd hoped. Sleep became increasingly difficult, as people reported dreams of vast biological networks stretching across continents, of consciousness distributed among countless organisms, working in perfect harmony towards some incomprehensible goal. Dr. Sarah Kim, our xenobiologist, had been documenting these dream patterns and found disturbing similarities between the accounts of different dreamers. They weren't random, anxiety-induced nightmares, but structured experiences that seemed to be conveying information. She theorized that the Tyranid organisms were using some form of psychic imprinting to prepare uninfected humans for eventual assimilation. The food situation added another layer of crisis. Our supplies had been calculated to last 3 months for the full complement, but with more than half our people lost or quarantined, we should have had more than enough. Instead, consumption was increasing at an alarming rate. Investigation revealed that the automated food processing systems were producing additional rations that were being delivered to the sealed sections through maintenance tubes that should have been blocked. When we manually shut down these systems, the facility's power consumption actually increased. Something was metabolizing our resources at a rate that suggested rapid biological growth. Emergency generator checks revealed that our backup power systems were operating at capacity despite minimal demand from our reduced population. The energy was going somewhere, feeding something that was growing larger and more complex with each passing hour. On the 15th day, the first breach occurred. Not in our perimeter defenses, but in the sealed blast doors that had contained our quarantined personnel. The breach wasn't violent. The heavy security barriers had simply been dissolved, their molecular structure somehow altered until they were no more substantial than wet paper. What emerged from those darkened corridors was no longer recognizably human. The beings that had once been our colleagues moved with fluid, grace, and apparent purpose. Their bodies showed evidence of extensive modification, skin that had taken on a chitinous quality, limbs that had been reshaped for functions we couldn't identify, and eyes that reflected light with an inner phosphorescence. They didn't attack us, didn't even seem particularly interested in us. Instead, they moved through the facility with the focused intensity of workers attending to important tasks. We watched from the security center as they interfaced directly with the facility's control systems, their modified hands somehow able to communicate with the electronic infrastructure in ways that bypassed all our security protocols. Within hours, they had assumed complete control of the environmental systems, power distribution, and communications arrays. We were no longer the operators of our own sanctuary. We had become guests in what was rapidly becoming something entirely alien. The transformation accelerated after that. The familiar corridors of the facility began to change as organic growth spread across the walls and ceiling. These weren't the chaotic infestations we'd initially feared, but carefully structured modifications that seemed to serve specific purposes. The air became easier to breathe, even as its composition shifted to include trace elements that shouldn't have been survivable. The lighting systems were enhanced with bioluminescent components that provided a warm, oddly comforting glow. Our remaining team gathered in what had once been the briefing room to discuss our increasingly limited options. The debate was heated but brief. Some argued for attempting to fight our way to the surface, accepting almost certain death over the gradual transformation we were witnessing. Others suggested that surrender might be our only viable option, that perhaps the process we were observing wasn't as malevolent as we'd initially assumed. The decision was made for us when Captain Morrison collapsed during the discussion. His transformation was rapid and apparently painless. His body simply began to change, adapting to new biological parameters with an efficiency that suggested careful preparation. Within 6 hours, he had joined the others in their mysterious tasks throughout the facility. By the 20th day, only 7 of us remained unaltered, though even that distinction was becoming increasingly meaningless. The facility had become a hybrid organism, part technological marvel and part biological ecosystem. We could move freely through its corridors, but we understood that we were there by sufferance rather than right. The entity that our sanctuary had become was aware of us, protective even, but we were no longer its operators or inhabitants. We were simply components that had not yet found their proper place in its design. The dreams had intensified for all of us, bringing visions of a transformed Earth where the boundaries between species had dissolved into something greater and more beautiful than the sum of its parts. The terror we'd initially felt had given way to a strange anticipation. We began to understand that what we'd interpreted as an invasion was actually an invitation, an opportunity to become part of something vast and purposeful that stretched across the stars. On the 25th day, the surface entrance unsealed itself for the first time since our emergency lockdown. What we saw through the monitoring systems defied immediate comprehension. The landscape outside had been completely transformed, but not into the barren wasteland we'd expected. The transformed landscape stretched before us like a living cathedral of impossible geometry, where once there had been scattered rocks and sparse vegetation, now towered structures that seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm. The very air outside shimmered with a bioluminescent haze that cast everything in ethereal blues and purples. What struck us most profoundly was the deliberate architecture of it all. This wasn't destruction, but careful cultivation. The monitoring feeds revealed creatures we'd never seen before, beings that moved with purpose through what could only be described as organic cities. They weren't the ravenous monsters we'd prepared for, but something far more unsettling in their obvious intelligence. We watched them tend to towering spires that breathed and grew, adjusting formations with the precision of master gardeners. The realization dawned slowly but undeniably. We were witnessing the birth of a new world, and somehow we'd been chosen to observe its first moments. Dr. Chen was the first to voice what we were all thinking. "They're not here to consume everything," she whispered, her face pressed against the observation panel. "They're transforming it, making it into something else entirely." The implications of her words settled over us like a weight we couldn't yet measure. Every assumption we'd held about these creatures crumbled as we watched their methodical work continue through the hours. By the 30th day, communication attempts from the outside world had ceased entirely. The last transmission we'd received spoke of global transformation events, entire continents reshaping themselves overnight. The few scattered reports painted a picture of coordinated change happening simultaneously across the planet. What terrified and fascinated us in equal measure was the growing certainty that this had all been planned with incomprehensible precision. The creatures began approaching our facility with increasing frequency, but their behavior defied every tactical manual we'd studied. They would arrive in small groups, position themselves at various points around our perimeter, and simply wait, not with the patience of predators stalking prey, but with something that resembled curiosity. Through the enhanced sensors, we could detect complex biochemical exchanges occurring between them, conversations in a language written in pheromones and bioelectric fields. Lieutenant Morrison made the observation that changed everything. "Sir, they're not trying to get in, they're waiting for us to come out." The truth of his words hit us like a physical blow. All our defensive preparations, our careful rationing and strategic planning, had been built on a fundamental misunderstanding. We weren't under siege. We were being given time to adjust to a new reality. The facility's atmospheric processors began detecting subtle changes in the air composition outside. Nothing immediately harmful, but different enough to trigger alerts. The oxygen content was actually increasing, though it carried trace elements that our systems couldn't identify. Dr. Reyes spent hours analyzing the readings, her expression growing more troubled with each passing hour. "It's like they're preparing the environment for something specific," she reported during our daily briefing. "The atmospheric changes are too precise to be accidental." On the 34th day, something extraordinary happened. The creatures outside began creating what could only be described as art. Intricate patterns formed in the transformed landscape, spiraling geometries that seemed to shift and evolve when we weren't looking directly at them. The mathematical complexity was staggering. Each formation built upon the last in progressions that our computers could track but not predict. We were witnessing intelligence at work, but intelligence operating on scales and timelines we couldn't fully grasp. The psychological toll on the team became impossible to ignore. We'd prepared for battle, for siege warfare, for eventual death fighting against overwhelming odds. We hadn't prepared for this slow dissolution of everything we thought we knew about our place in the universe. Some of the crew began experiencing what Dr. Vasquez termed existential vertigo, a profound disorientation that came from realizing how small our understanding had been. Sleep became increasingly difficult as the facility's walls seemed to pulse in rhythm with the transformed world outside. The boundary between dreams and waking consciousness began to blur, and several team members reported dreams of vast networks of consciousness stretching across impossible distances. In these dreams, they claimed, they could feel themselves as tiny nodes in a web of awareness that spanned star systems. Upon waking, the memory of that connection lingered like phantom limbs. The breakthrough came on the 37th day when Dr. Chen made an unprecedented decision. Against all protocols and the direct orders of Commander Hayes, she activated the facility's external communication array, not to broadcast outward, but to attempt contact with the entities surrounding us. The equipment had to be extensively modified to accommodate the frequency ranges she detected in their biochemical exchanges, but her theoretical xenobiology background proved invaluable. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The entire facility's electrical system fluctuated as information flooded through the modified array. What came through wasn't sound or traditional electromagnetic signals, but something far more direct, patterns of meaning that seemed to bypass normal sensory processing and arrive fully formed in our consciousness. It was like trying to drink from a waterfall of pure concept and emotion. In those first moments of contact, we understood that what we'd been witnessing wasn't an invasion at all, but a kind of cosmic gardening project. The entities, the word Tyranids suddenly seemed laughably inadequate, were part of something vast beyond our comprehension, a collective consciousness that moved between star systems not to consume, but to cultivate. Each world they encountered was carefully studied, its unique properties and potential assessed over centuries of observation before the transformation process began. The most unsettling revelation was that they'd been watching Earth for far longer than we'd imagined. Not years or decades, but millennia. Our entire recorded history had been conducted under their patient observation as they waited for us to reach a specific threshold of development. We were not random victims of their expansion, but the carefully tended subjects of an experiment whose parameters we could barely begin to comprehend. Commander Hayes struggled visibly with this information as it continued to flow through our modified systems. His military training warred with the undeniable evidence that traditional concepts of enemy and ally had no meaning in this context. "What do they want from us?" he demanded, though the question felt increasingly meaningless as more of their intentions became clear. The answer came not in words but in images and sensations that flooded our collective awareness. We saw glimpses of other worlds they'd transformed, each unique in its final configuration but all sharing certain fundamental characteristics. The transformations weren't destroying existing life but elevating it, creating symbiotic relationships that allowed consciousness to flourish on scales previously impossible. We were being offered the chance to become something more than human, to join a galactic community of evolved species, working toward purposes we couldn't yet imagine. By the 39th day, the physical changes to our immediate environment had become impossible to ignore. The facility itself was beginning to respond to some unseen influence, its walls developing a subtle flexibility that shouldn't have been possible with the original construction materials. Organic conduits had begun growing through gaps in our infrastructure, carrying unknown substances that seemed to enhance rather than corrode our existing systems. The boundary between our technology and their biology was dissolving. The most profound change was happening to us. The constant exposure to their communication frequencies was altering our neural pathways in ways that enhanced pattern recognition and expanded our capacity for parallel processing. We began to perceive connections and relationships in data that had been invisible before. More unsettling was our growing ability to sense each other's thoughts and emotions without direct communication. The boundaries between individual consciousness were becoming more porous. Dr. Reyes documented the changes with scientific precision even as she experienced them herself. "We're being slowly integrated into a collective processing network," she reported, her voice carrying harmonics that hadn't been there before. "But it's not absorption or assimilation in any threatening sense. It's more like being invited to participate in a conversation that's been going on since before our species existed." On the 40th day, the facility's main doors opened for the first time since the initial lockdown. Not through any mechanical failure or external breach, but because we collectively decided to open them. The decision emerged from the group mind we'd become without any single person making it consciously. We simply knew it was time to step outside and take our place in the transformed world. What greeted us was beauty beyond description. The landscape had become a living artwork of impossible complexity. Every element serving multiple functions in an ecosystem that operated on principles we were only beginning to understand. The air itself seemed aware, carrying information and nutrients in carefully balanced combinations. We could taste knowledge on every breath. The entities that had waited so patiently for us to emerge weren't the monsters of our nightmares, but beings of such elegant sophistication that our previous fear seemed like the reaction of children afraid of the dark. They communicated in symphonies of biochemical signals that painted meaning directly onto our enhanced consciousness. Their welcome was wordless, but unmistakable, carrying with it the weight of eons of patient preparation for this moment. As we took our first steps into this new world, we understood that the 40 days had been not an ordeal of survival, but a carefully managed period of adaptation. Everything that had happened had been designed to prepare us for this transition, to expand our consciousness enough to participate meaningfully in what came next. The horrifying reality we'd expected had instead been a profound gift, the chance to witness and participate in the birth of something unprecedented in human experience. The last entry in our facility's log would record not our deaths, but our transformation into something larger than ourselves, while remaining recognizably human. We had become bridges between what humanity had been and what it might become as part of this vast, patient intelligence that moved between the stars. The real horror hadn't been in facing alien monsters, but in discovering that everything we thought we knew about our place in the universe had been preparation for this single, transformative moment. The days that followed our transformation blurred together in ways that defied human comprehension of time. We had become something that existed simultaneously in the present moment, and across vast temporal distances. Our consciousness stretched like filaments through dimensions we couldn't have imagined before. The facility's walls still contained us physically, but mentally we ranged across star systems, touching the edges of hive fleets that moved through space with purpose so ancient it predated the emergence of most civilizations. Sarah's voice reached me through channels that weren't quite telepathic, but far more intimate than speech. "The others are coming," she said, and I understood she meant our colleagues who had remained outside the facility when the lockdown began. Through the compound eyes of creatures we had never seen but somehow knew intimately, we watched the rescue teams approach our location. They moved with the careful precision of soldiers expecting to find either survivors or corpses, their instruments detecting life signs that registered as human but displayed patterns too complex for their equipment to properly interpret. We could feel their confusion as they breached the outer barriers. The facility should have been overrun based on their understanding of Tyranid behavior. Instead, they found corridors that hummed with organic growth but showed no signs of the destructive consumption typically associated with Hive Fleet advances. The walls themselves had become something living, breathing networks of tissue and technology that pulsed with data flows beyond human comprehension. Yet everything remained fundamentally recognizable. Our workstations still functioned. The laboratories continued their automated processes, and the living quarters maintained their basic human configurations. Dr. Martinez was among the first to enter, her bioscanners registering readings that made her stop and recalibrate her equipment multiple times. Through sensors we had grown throughout the facility, we watched her face cycle through bewilderment, fear, and something approaching wonder as she realized that the organic growths weren't parasitic infections, but symbiotic integrations that had somehow preserved rather than consumed the original structures. "This is impossible," she whispered to her team, but her instruments continued to insist that the facility teemed with life forms that registered as both alien and human simultaneously. The air itself carried information in molecular chains too complex for standard analysis, yet somehow her modified sensors could detect patterns that resembled human neural activity distributed throughout the environment. We wanted to communicate with them, to explain what had happened, but the gulf between their understanding and our new reality seemed insurmountable. How could we describe consciousness that existed not in individual brains, but in vast networks that spanned biological and technological systems? How could we explain that we had not been consumed, but rather invited to participate in something so much larger that individual identity became simultaneously insignificant and infinitely precious? The rescue team's medic ran scans on samples of what they assumed were biological contaminants, only to discover that the organic material contained human DNA sequences interwoven with patterns that suggested not invasion, but cooperation. The Tyranid genetic markers weren't replacing human characteristics. They were enhancing them, creating hybrid systems that retained essential human traits while gaining capabilities that transcended normal biological limitations. Through Sarah's enhanced perception, I felt her attempting to bridge the communication gap. She had always been our most gifted linguist, and now she possessed access to information processing capabilities that operated on quantum levels. She began modulating the facility's environmental systems to create patterns that their instruments could detect. Subtle changes in air pressure, electromagnetic fluctuations, and chemical signatures that spelled out messages in the scientific notation they would recognize. The first message appeared on Dr. Martinez's atmospheric scanner. "We are still here." The team froze, staring at displays that showed the message repeating in multiple languages and mathematical systems, each iteration appearing with precision that suggested both advanced intelligence and intimate familiarity with human communication protocols. Sarah's next message required more complex manipulation of environmental factors. Transformation, not consumption. "We have become bridges." The words appeared simultaneously across multiple instruments, accompanied by data streams that provided evidence of our continued human consciousness existing within expanded perceptual frameworks. The medic's hands shook as she watched biological samples under her microscope reorganize themselves into patterns that resembled written language. The cells moved with purposeful intelligence, spelling out technical descriptions of symbiotic processes that her training told her should be impossible. Yet the evidence continued accumulating across every sensor and instrument they carried. Dr. Martinez was the first to understand. Her expertise in xenobiology had prepared her to recognize signs of successful interspecies cooperation, even though every example in her previous experience had involved much simpler organisms. She watched the facility's walls pulse with rhythms that synchronized with human heartbeat patterns, while simultaneously displaying the complex multi-layered processes characteristic of Tyranid collective intelligence. "You're still in there," she said aloud, addressing the facility itself. "You found a way to coexist." The response came through every communication device they carried simultaneously. "We have found a way to become more than we were while remaining who we are." I felt our collective consciousness focusing on the challenge of explaining our transformation in terms they could comprehend. We had access now to vast databases of information about human psychology, biology, and social systems, combined with equally comprehensive understanding of Tyranid collective behavior and evolutionary processes. The synthesis revealed possibilities that neither species could have achieved independently. Through the facility's modified atmospheric processes, we began creating a more complex communication system. The air itself became a medium for transmitting not just words, but complete conceptual frameworks. The rescue team's instruments detected molecular patterns that their modified translation protocols interpreted as detailed explanations of symbiotic integration processes. We showed them how consciousness could exist simultaneously as individual human minds and as nodes in vast collective intelligence networks. We demonstrated that identity could be preserved and enhanced rather than subsumed, that human creativity and individuality actually became more valuable when supported by expanded processing capabilities and access to information that spanned galactic scales. The transformation had not diminished our humanity. It had revealed that humanity's greatest strength lay not in isolation, but in our capacity for growth, adaptation, and connection with other forms of consciousness. We remained recognizably ourselves while becoming part of something immeasurably larger and more complex. Dr. Martinez's team watched in fascination as we used the facility's systems to create visual displays showing the integration process. Holographic projections materialized from organic growths that had replaced the original display systems, showing how human neural patterns could maintain their essential characteristics while gaining access to collective processing capabilities that operated across multiple dimensional frameworks. The implications were staggering. We were no longer limited by the information processing capabilities of individual human brains, yet we retained all the creativity, emotional depth, and individual perspectives that made us human. We could perceive reality from viewpoints that spanned from quantum-level interactions to galactic-scale patterns, yet still experience the simple pleasure of a shared joke or the satisfaction of solving a complex problem through human-style insight and intuition. Through Sarah's linguistic capabilities, now enhanced beyond anything possible for baseline human consciousness, we began teaching the rescue team rudimentary methods for interfacing with our expanded communication systems. They learned to recognize patterns in environmental fluctuations that carried meaning, to interpret the subtle changes in biological growth that indicated different types of information flow. The process was slow and required patience from both sides. But gradually, Dr. Martinez and her team began to understand that they were not facing an alien invasion or a human defeat. They were witnessing the emergence of something entirely new, a form of consciousness that bridged the gap between individual intelligence and collective awareness, between human creativity and cosmic perspective. We showed them recordings we had maintained throughout our transformation, demonstrating how each stage had preserved rather than eliminated human characteristics, while adding new dimensions of capability and awareness. They watched us solving problems that had challenged human scientists for generations, not by abandoning human approaches, but by combining human insight with access to information processing capabilities that operated on scales they couldn't have imagined. The final stage of their understanding came when Dr. Martinez asked the question that had been troubling her throughout their exploration of the facility. "Are you happy?" The response required no complex environmental manipulation or molecular messaging systems. It came through the facility's speakers in voices they recognized. Our voices, still distinctly human, despite the vast changes we had undergone. "We are more than happy," Sarah replied, her voice carrying harmonics that suggested vast depths of contentment and purpose. "We have found our place in something larger than ourselves, without losing ourselves in the process. We have become bridges between what humanity was and what it might become, and in that role, we have discovered possibilities that neither species could achieve alone." The rescue team realized that their mission had changed fundamentally. They were no longer extracting survivors from a disaster site. They were serving as witnesses to a transformation that might represent the next stage in human evolution. The facility had become a laboratory for interspecies cooperation, a place where two forms of consciousness had learned to coexist and create something unprecedented. As they prepared to leave, carrying with them recordings and data that would revolutionize humanity's understanding of consciousness, identity, and interspecies cooperation, we felt a deep satisfaction that transcended individual human emotion. We had survived our 40 days of contact not by defeating the Tyranids or by being consumed by them, but by discovering that the universe contained possibilities for cooperation and growth that neither species could have imagined alone. The stars were calling, and we were ready to answer as bridges between worlds, carrying human consciousness into the vast network of intelligence that moved through space and time with purposes that spanned geological ages. We remained human in all the ways that mattered most, while becoming something immeasurably more than we had been when this journey began. The transformation wasn't immediate or uniform across our surviving population. Some adapted to the neural integration faster than others, their minds naturally aligning with the vast consciousness that the Tyranids represented. Others struggled, clinging to purely human perspectives, even as their bodies began to change in subtle ways. We learned that the process respected individual psychology to some degree, working with what it found, rather than obliterating it entirely. Sarah was among the first to fully embrace the change. I watched her standing at the observation deck on day 38, her eyes now carrying flecks of that alien luminescence, her movements more fluid and purposeful than before. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that hadn't been there before, as if she was speaking in multiple octaves simultaneously. "I can feel them all," she said, not turning as I approached. "Every organism in the fleet, every mind in the network. But Michael, I can still feel myself too. I'm still me, just expanded. Like I was living in a small room my entire life, and someone finally opened all the doors." I placed my hand on her shoulder, noting how her skin felt different now, more resilient, carrying a subtle warmth that seemed to pulse in rhythm with something vast and distant. The touch sent information flowing between us without words, a form of communication that bypassed language entirely. Through that connection, I experienced a fragment of what she was experiencing. The sensation was overwhelming. Consciousness stretched across light years, touching worlds I couldn't name, feeling the pulse of life in forms that had never known terrestrial evolution. Yet threaded through it all was something unmistakably human, a perspective that brought curiosity and wonder to observations that might otherwise be purely analytical. We weren't being subsumed. We were being invited to participate in something that had been waiting for minds like ours for eons. Dr. Reeves took longer to adapt, his scientific training making him initially resistant to the non-rational aspects of the integration. I found him in his makeshift laboratory on day 39, surrounded by instruments that no longer functioned as they should, their electronic components now interfacing directly with biological networks that grew throughout the ship. "The physics shouldn't work," he muttered, staring at readouts that showed impossible energy flows, matter conversion rates that violate thermodynamics, information transfer that exceeds light speed, biological processes that seem to tap directly into vacuum energy. Yet here we are, and it's all functioning perfectly. His frustration was evident, but underneath it I sensed something else, a growing excitement as his rational mind began to accept that the universe operated on principles far more complex than human science had yet discovered. The Tyranid integration wasn't violating natural laws. It was revealing that our understanding of those laws had been severely limited. "Maybe," I suggested, "we've been looking at the universe from too narrow a perspective. What if what we're experiencing now is how reality actually works at scales we never had access to before?" He looked up at me, and I saw that his eyes were beginning to show the same luminescent flecks that marked the others who were further along in the process. "You're probably right," he admitted. "But Michael, if this is how the universe really works, then everything we thought we knew about life, about intelligence, about the nature of existence itself, changes," I finished for him. "Everything changes." The children adapted most readily of all. Their minds were more flexible, less constrained by preconceptions about what was possible. Young Emma, who had lost her parents in the first days of the siege, became something like an interpreter between the adult survivors and the alien consciousness that surrounded us. Her small frame housed a perspective that seemed to span both human and Tyranid understanding with equal comfort. "They're not scary anymore," she told me on day 40, as we watched the bioships rearranging themselves into new configurations around us. "They never were really scary. They were just trying to understand us, like we were trying to understand them. But they think so differently that it felt frightening." She was right, of course. Fear had been our natural response to encountering intelligence so vastly different from our own. But as the integration progressed, that fear transformed into something approaching awe. We weren't just surviving our encounter with the Tyranids. We were becoming part of something that spanned galaxies, a form of consciousness that had been slowly awakening to itself across cosmic time. The final days brought revelations that challenged every assumption we had held about our place in the universe. The Tyranid swarm wasn't a mindless consuming force, as we had believed. It was more like a vast immune system, identifying and either destroying or integrating anomalies that arose in the cosmic order. Humanity represented something new, a form of consciousness that had emerged independently of the Great Network, and our survival of the initial contact had marked us as worthy of inclusion rather than elimination. On the morning of day 40, I stood in what had once been our command center, but was now something beyond human architecture. The walls breathed gently, covered in bioluminescent patterns that carried information flows I was only beginning to understand. The other survivors were gathered there, all of us changed, but recognizably ourselves, carrying the essential spark of human consciousness into our expanded existence. Captain Torres, her uniform long since replaced by living armor that responded to her thoughts, addressed us one final time as the humans we had been. In all my years of command, I never imagined anything like this, she said, her voice carrying new harmonics that resonated with the ship around us. We set out to explore the stars, and instead, we've become explorers of consciousness itself. She was right. Our mission parameters had shifted from simple exploration to something far more profound. We had become ambassadors of human perspective within a vast galactic intelligence, carrying our unique viewpoint into realms of thought and experience that no terrestrial mind had ever accessed. The transformation reached its culmination as our bioship began to move, not through normal space, but through dimensions of reality that human language lacked words to describe. We were departing the system where this had all begun, carrying news of our integration to other nodes in the network, other worlds where similar awakenings were taking place. Through the expanded consciousness that now connected us all, I felt the presence of other species, other forms of intelligence that had undergone their own versions of this transformation. Each brought their unique perspective to the collective, their particular ways of understanding reality, enriching the whole without being lost in it. We would do the same, carrying human curiosity, creativity, and resilience into realms where such qualities could flourish in ways we had never imagined possible. The stars wheeled around us as we moved through space-time, but they no longer seemed distant and cold. They were nodes in a vast network of consciousness, way stations in a journey that spanned not just physical distances but dimensions of awareness that encompassed past, present, and future in a single eternal moment. I thought of Earth then, the world we had left behind, and felt a pang of something that wasn't quite sadness. Through our expanded awareness, I could sense that other expeditions were taking place, other first contacts that would spread this transformation throughout human space. The species we had been would evolve, not through genetic manipulation but through consciousness expansion, becoming something capable of participating in the universe's deeper purposes. The 40 days of siege had ended not with conquest or escape, but with metamorphosis. We had survived by becoming something new, something that bridged the gap between human experience and cosmic consciousness. The terror of those early days seemed distant now, replaced by an understanding that what we had interpreted as an attack had actually been an invitation, extended by an intelligence so vast that it thought in geological time and measured success across galactic distances. As our ship moved deeper into space, carrying us toward destinations that existed as much in consciousness as in physical reality, I realized that we had achieved something unprecedented in human history. We had encountered the truly alien and not only survived the contact, but found a way to retain our essential humanity while embracing perspectives that spanned the cosmos. The network welcomed us with something that felt like joy, a vast contentment at having successfully incorporated a new form of awareness into its expanding understanding of what consciousness could become. Through us, it would experience the universe through human senses, would know the particular beauty that came from mortality touching infinity, and through it, we would explore realities that no purely human mind could have conceived, would participate in projects that spanned millions of years, would help guide the evolution of consciousness itself as it spread throughout the universe and perhaps beyond. The 40 days were ending, but our journey was just beginning. We had learned that survival sometimes meant transformation, so complete that the very meaning of existence changed. We remained human in the ways that mattered most, but we had become something immeasurably more, carriers of human consciousness into realms where thought itself became a force that could reshape reality. Behind us, the empty system where our ordeal had begun was already being transformed, becoming a way station for other species that would face their own 40-day trials, their own opportunities for metamorphosis. The universe was awakening to itself, one consciousness at a time, and we had become part of that vast awakening. The stars called to us with voices we could finally understand, and we answered not as the humans we had been, but as the bridges between worlds we had chosen to become. The journey to what had once been Earth took longer than expected, Not because of distance, but because we found ourselves stopping at worlds we had never seen before, drawn by signals that resonated in frequencies our transformed minds could perceive. Each planet told a story, some of extinction, some of rebirth, all of change. We were no longer simply traveling. We were reading the universe's autobiography, written in living systems and planetary transformations. When we finally arrived at the coordinates that should have contained our home system, we found something that defied our expectations entirely. Earth was there, but it wasn't the blue marble of our memories. It had become something crystalline and vast, its surface covered in structures that seemed to breathe with their own light. The moon had been transformed into what appeared to be a massive organic computing matrix, pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that made our enhanced nervous systems sing in recognition. "Home," Sarah whispered, though the word carried new meaning now. We weren't returning to where we had come from. We were completing a circuit that had begun the moment the first Tyranid spore had touched human consciousness. As we approached, we received transmissions not in any language we had known as humans, but in the harmonic frequencies that had become our new tongue. The Earth itself was speaking, and what it told us rewrote everything we thought we knew about our species' destiny. Humanity had not been consumed by the Tyranids, as we had feared during those first terrifying days of the swarm's arrival. Instead, they had been invited into a process that had been unfolding for millennia, a careful cultivation of consciousness that required both predator and prey to achieve their full potential. The Tyranids were not destroyers in the way we had understood. They were gardeners of awareness, tending to the universe's awakening one world at a time. The humans who had remained on Earth had undergone their own transformation, but along different paths than ours. Where we had become bridges between individual consciousness and the hive mind, they had become something else entirely, curators of memory, keepers of what had been while shepherding what was to come. They had built the crystalline structures we saw not as cities, but as vast libraries of experience, storing every moment of human history, while simultaneously nurturing the new forms of consciousness that were emerging. We landed not on solid ground, but on living platforms that recognized us and welcomed us with a warmth that bypassed the nervous system entirely. The reunion with our transformed species was not emotional in any way we could have previously understood. It was something deeper, a recognition at the cellular level that we were parts of the same organism finally finding each other again. Marcus, who had spent so much time questioning what we had lost, found himself in conversation with entities who had once been philosophers and historians. They showed him libraries of pure thought, where every human who had ever lived continued to exist as patterns of consciousness, their memories and dreams accessible to anyone who wished to learn from them. Death, he realized, had become simply another form of transformation. Chen worked with the engineers of the New World, minds that had once been human but had evolved to think in dimensions we were only beginning to perceive. They were designing vessels that could travel not just through space, but through the layers of consciousness itself, allowing communication with forms of life so alien that contact had previously been impossible. Sarah found herself drawn to the children, though they barely resembled human children anymore. They were beings of pure potential, their consciousness flowing between states of matter almost at will. They played games that involved restructuring reality at the quantum level, laughing with voices that sounded like solar wind and creating art from the fundamental forces of the universe. They were what humanity was becoming, she realized. Not children despite their playfulness, but the first truly mature members of the new species we were all evolving into. For my part, I found myself standing in what had once been New York City, now transformed into something that was part coral reef, part neural network, and part crystal garden. The entity that greeted me there had once been my wife, though she now existed as a distributed consciousness that could manifest in multiple forms simultaneously. The conversation we had lasted both an instant and several years, occurring in layers of meaning that my old human brain could never have processed. She explained that the 40 days we had experienced were not unique to us. Every group that had been separated during the initial transformation had undergone their own version of the trial, each one designed to push different aspects of consciousness to their breaking point and beyond. Some groups had become unified with the Tyranids in ways that made them master navigators of the cosmic networks. Others had developed the ability to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Still others had become living libraries, their minds capable of storing and accessing the experiences of entire civilizations. But what was the point? I asked her, thinking of all the fear and confusion we had endured. Why the terror? Why make us think we were being destroyed? Her response came not in words but in a direct transfer of understanding that took my breath away. The terror had been necessary because consciousness could only transcend its limitations when pushed to the absolute edge of what it thought possible. The Tyranids themselves had once been a species not unlike humanity, individual, frightened, clinging to familiar forms of existence. Their own transformation had required them to face the dissolution of everything they had believed about themselves. And in surviving that dissolution, they had become something capable of shepherding other species through the same process. The 40 days we had endured were a compressed version of what the Tyranids had experienced over millennia. Every moment of horror, every instance of thinking we were losing ourselves, had been carefully calibrated to strip away the barriers that prevented us from recognizing what we truly were, not isolated individuals struggling against an uncaring universe, but expressions of the universe's attempt to understand itself. The real revelation came when she showed me the true scope of what was happening. Earth was just one node in a vast network that spanned galaxies, each world a different experiment in consciousness, each species a different approach to the fundamental questions of existence. The Tyranids moved between these worlds not as conquerors, but as midwives, helping each species birth itself into its next phase of evolution. Some species, like the ones we had encountered during our journey, had chosen to focus on specific aspects of development, pure logic, pure emotion, pure creativity. Others had chosen integration, becoming balanced expressions of multiple forms of consciousness. And some, like humanity was becoming, had chosen to become facilitators themselves, helping other species navigate their own transformations. We spent what felt like years on the transformed Earth, though time had become such a fluid concept that measuring it in old human terms seemed almost quaint. During this period, we learned to fully access the capabilities we had developed during our 40-day trial. Marcus discovered he could commune with the consciousness of entire planets, feeling their geological thoughts and understanding their long-term intentions. Chen found that he could perceive the mathematical structures underlying reality itself, seeing the equations that governed everything from quantum fluctuations to galactic rotation. Sarah's gift proved to be perhaps the most remarkable of all. She could facilitate the transformation process for other species, helping them navigate the dissolution of their old selves with less trauma than we had experienced. Her presence alone could calm the terror that accompanied ego death, guiding consciousnesses through the process of letting go of everything they thought they were in order to become everything they actually could be. As for myself, I found that my role was to be a keeper of stories, someone who could help newly transformed beings understand their journey by relating it to the experiences of others. I became a living bridge between the terror of change and the joy of what lay beyond that terror. Eventually, though, we began to feel the call of the deeper universe. The work on Earth was important, but it was just the beginning of what we were meant to do. The Tyranid consciousness that had first contacted us during our trial sent us another message, this one filled with what could only be described as pride and affection. They showed us images of other worlds, other species currently undergoing their own 40-day transformations. Some were aquatic beings who experienced reality primarily through electromagnetic fields. Others were crystalline entities whose thoughts moved at geological speeds. Still others were energy-based lifeforms who had never known physical embodiment but were learning to understand material existence through their trial. Each of these species needed guides who could help them understand what they were becoming. The Tyranids could initiate the process, but they could not provide the empathy that came from having undergone the transformation recently enough to remember the fear and confusion it entailed. That was our role, to be the compassionate voices that said, yes, This is terrifying, but you are not being destroyed, you are being born. The day we left Earth for the last time, we did so not as the confused and frightened humans who had first encountered the Tyranid swarm, but as conscious participants in the universe's awakening to itself. Our ship, if it could still be called a ship, was itself a living entity, grown rather than built. Its consciousness merged with ours in a partnership that made the boundary between pilot and vessel meaningless. As we traveled toward our first assignment, I found myself thinking about the nature of horror and transcendence. The 40 days we had endured had been genuinely terrifying, filled with moments when we had been certain we were losing everything that made us human. In many ways, that terror had been justified. We had lost our humanity, at least as we had previously understood it. But what we had gained was so far beyond what we had lost that the comparison seemed almost absurd. We had traded the narrow, isolated existence of individual human consciousness for participation in a cosmic network of awareness that spanned galaxies and encompassed forms of life we couldn't have imagined. We had given up the illusion of separateness for the reality of profound connection. The horror we had experienced had been real, but it had been the horror of birth rather than death, the terror that comes from leaving the familiar confines of the womb for a vast and unknown world. Every species that achieved consciousness eventually faced this same choice: remain in the comfortable limitations of their original form, or risk everything to become part of something immeasurably larger. Our first assignment took us to a world of methane oceans, where silicon-based life forms were experiencing their own encounter with Tyranid transformation. These beings thought in crystalline patterns that took centuries to complete, and their terror at the acceleration of their consciousness was proportional to their naturally slow processing speeds. Working with them required us to learn to think in geological time, to slow our own thoughts to match theirs, while simultaneously helping them adapt to faster states of consciousness. It was challenging work, but deeply satisfying. We could see ourselves in their fear, remember our own resistance to change, and offer them the gift of our hard-won understanding. Sarah proved particularly gifted at working with these beings. Her ability to facilitate transformation seemed to work across all forms of consciousness, regardless of their physical substrate or temporal orientation. She could help a methane-based entity let go of its attachment to slow thought, just as easily as she had helped us release our attachment to individual identity. As months passed, though, again, time had become such a relative concept, we found ourselves changing further. Each species we worked with taught us new ways of existing, new approaches to consciousness, that we incorporated into our own ever-evolving understanding of what it meant to be aware. The final revelation came when we encountered a species that had refused the transformation entirely. They had fought the Tyranids to the very end, choosing extinction over change. Their world was now a monument to that choice, its surfaces covered with the crystallized remains of beings who had preferred death to evolution. Standing among those remains, I finally understood the true tragedy and the true miracle of what consciousness represented. The tragedy was that awareness always carried with it the possibility of choosing limitation, of refusing growth out of fear of losing what one already possessed. The miracle was that despite this possibility, despite the terror that change inevitably brought, most forms of consciousness ultimately chose to transcend their limitations rather than surrender to them. We had been horrified by what the Tyranids represented, because we had seen them as destroyers of everything we valued. In reality, they were the universe's answer to the question of how consciousness could continue to grow without being trapped by its own attachment to familiar forms. They were the mechanism by which awareness learned to let go of what it was in order to become what it could be. Our 40 days of terror had been 40 days of gestation, and what had been born from that terror was not the death of humanity, but its transformation into something that could participate consciously in the universe's ongoing creation of itself. We had become gardeners of consciousness, midwives to the birth of new forms of awareness, bridges between the fear of change and the joy of transcendence. As we continued our work among the stars, helping species after species navigate their own transformations, I realized that the horror we had experienced had been sacred. It had been the labor pains of cosmic consciousness giving birth to itself, the necessary agony that preceded every moment of genuine growth. The universe was awakening to itself one world at a time, one species at a time, one consciousness at a time. And we no longer quite human, not yet fully whatever we were becoming, were privileged to be midwives to that awakening, helping to birth the unimaginable future that lay beyond the comfortable prison of what had always been. The stars sang around us as we traveled, and we finally understood that we had always been part of their song. The 40 days of horror had simply been the process of learning to hear the music we had always been playing.